And due to time, we're going to jump to our presentation for today. And Steve Conway has been around, I was going to say forever, pretty much.
Feels like it.
Yeah. I don't know if he needs an introduction to any of you, but Steve, a long time ago, was in our district office. He's been in another district office in Canada for many years. He's kind of my right-hand guy turned to for wisdom and counsel when it comes to revitalization and turnaround. He's done a ton of interims for us in very critical situations as well. Someone outside of our organization has referred to him as the Velvet Hammer. He comes with an ability and wisdom to speak to things that are difficult and challenging and hard, but does it in a very graceful way. And I've asked him to share with us today along the idea of being a thermometer or a thermostat. And I'll let him introduce that and take us through this brief time.
Okay. Well, I want us to think together about leading in the midst of anxiety. And obviously the last year and a half or so has had no shortage of angst and stress, pandemic, racial reckoning, political divisiveness, you name it. And then you add to that the fact that there's often just a lot of conflict in the church, where we would hope for some peace, but often that's not the case. I want to start by just sharing a little story that Brennan Manning writes about in one of his books. Talks about a Cajun farmer who's out hoeing in his vegetable garden, and someone runs up kind of in a panic and says, just, Richard, come quick, your house is on fire. And the Cajun farmer drops his hoe and immediately starts running a lickety-split down the road, kind of dreading what would lie ahead. And he can see a crowd forming down the road where there's smoke billowing up. And so he starts to run faster. And then all of a sudden he stops himself in his tracks and he says, what in the heck am I worried about? My name isn't Richard, and I don't even own a house. Now, that little story tends to illustrate some dynamics of anxiety. The first one, and Amber, this is on a slide somewhere. Anxiety is contagious. You've probably noticed that. It manifests itself kind of in the herd instinct. And then a second dynamic is that anxiety often is driven by irrational emotions. Doesn't make sense. And then thirdly, anxious people tend to reflect their environment. And so that's the thermometer. They just kind of register up and down depending on what's going on around them. And the fourth dynamic is that anxiety tends to trigger the fight or flight response in all of us. So as we continue to kind of probe into this idea of how do we lead in the midst of an anxious environment, I'm sure that you've discovered by now that being in a turnaround setting or how revitalization setting in and of itself tends to produce anxiety both within us as leaders and in our congregation. And one of our functions as turnaround leaders is that of change agent. And someone has said the only person who really enjoys change is a wet baby. So change tends to spark anxiety. Have you noticed that? And so that's the rub for us. Anxiety is contagious, and people then get whipped up into a lather and tend to then start looking for a scapegoat. They want to blame somebody. And sometimes that means that we as leaders have a target on our back, whether we want it there or not. And so people begin to sometimes vent, direct their anxiety towards us. And they often want quick fixes, even though the issue that they may be dealing with has taken years to develop. They want you to fix it, and they want it done now. Their overriding motivation is to somehow alleviate the anxiety, the angst that they're feeling. And often this causes, in a church setting, for people then to turn inward and do some navel gazing, and so they abandon their missional thrust. So they become very inward focused. And you've probably noticed that in those kind of environments, the leader can be pulled in all different directions. Sometimes it feels like you're caught in the midst of this giant tug of war. Someone said that it's like being a stray dog at a Whistler's convention. And, here, boy, this way. And it's really difficult to not get sucked into the vortex of all that's going around, the swirling emotions that are in the group around you. And so that's the question for us as leaders today is, so how can we function more like a thermostat than a thermometer? How can we be self-regulated, managed, even though people around us are freaking out? So I want us to think together about 3 common responses to anxiety, regardless of your setting, but is true in the church. And the first one is what has been called enmeshment. And if you can picture 2 circles here, these circles are intended to illustrate that in enmeshment, or emotional fusion, that's often referred to, people get they lose their boundaries, and they just become part of one another. They have no way of distinguishing where they end and someone else starts. And so we talk about codependency develops. If people are feeling up, then I feel up. If people are feeling down, then I feel down. And sometimes that can be in our marriage as well. Sometimes we're too close. So the tension is between togetherness and separateness. And in health, those are held in creative tension. So there's a loss of boundaries in enmeshment, and it results sometimes in over-functioning. In other words, I am assuming more responsibility than I should. And the need to be needed dominates. And there's kind of this culture that insists on peace at any price. And the kingdom of nicety can reign supreme. Everyone doesn't want to rock the boat. And as we said, irrational emotions and black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, can tend to prevail in the group think. And the sad thing is that often when there's high anxiety in a congregation, the most immature people gain disproportionate influence. People actually start to look to them for signals of how to react and respond. Or they act out in ways that really cause others to follow, even though they may inside know that that's not the best response. And it's easy to sacrifice principle and personal convictions. So there's obviously an unhealthy response of enmeshment or emotional fusion. Um, and I'd like for you to be thinking on the side here of how you see these in the ministry of Jesus. And we'll come back to that later. But we move from enmeshment. Another response is what we refer to as detachment. So this is the opposite of enmeshment. So you can think of these two circles as totally separate from each other. They're removed from each other. And this is the temptation to retreat, to distance ourselves, especially when we've been beat up emotionally by church bullies. And I don't know if you've encountered them, but I can almost detect who that person is within a few hours of being in a group. Now, they may be unintentional dragons. They may have no intention, or they may seem quite nice on the outside. But the tendency that I know I have had is to withdraw, to create some distance. I don't want to be around those people. They're not fun. They have jagged edges. They poke you. And so the tendency then is to hunker in the bunker, and we become risk adverse and conflict avoidance. There's conflict avoidance. And so we duck making the hard calls with these people, and we protect ourselves. And you know these people. They may be well-intentioned, but they can be like a cancer in the body that really spreads. And the disease then becomes a corporate kind of thing. The unfortunate thing of detachment is, though it solves the immediate issue of the negative influence of others, it removes us as the leader from the group where God has called us to model a more mature Christ-like response to anxiety and angst. And we want to be a positive influence, and that's a hard thing to do when you're you haven't sustained appropriate connection with others. So there's enmeshment. We've talked about now detachment. And now the third positive, healthy response is differentiation. And these two circles, although I couldn't get them to do this on my computer, I wanted to see there's overlap. There's areas of our life where we're together that we share, but there's also separation. We're apart from one another. So there's both. They're held in tension, and the trick is to know how much of me, or when do I lean into this and be together, and when do I consciously remove myself, at least emotionally, from the anxiety that's swirling around me. So staying relationally connected is the challenge we face as leaders, and not demonizing our detractors. I don't know about you, but boy, it's real easy to put them, label them, and you see them walk in the door on Sunday morning, and I want to find something else to do that's in a different part of the building. And so it's really hard to lean into that relationship and really sustain it, even though it's difficult and hard. And so that brings up the whole issue of boundaries, which I know is not a new concept. And many of you could talk a long time about how God has taught you how to build good boundaries, how establishing those has helped, and how you've learned to develop some rhythms of self-care. The classic book on boundaries by Cloud and Townsend, they use the illustration of boundaries can be like chalk lines if they're not strong enough, so they get smudged and they're easily violated. And their suggestion is that make them more like a picket fence. There's some space, but it's clear. It's harder to violate. And then you want a gate, but the latch needs to be on the inside. So you choose when and how and who to come into your yard. And what we want to avoid is for those fences to become walls. Developing boundaries is huge. And I have found that church people don't understand this very well. They think you're not being a caring, loving shepherd if you set boundaries. You're not being nice. So Christians are always nice. But it's essential if we're going to sustain a ministry of revitalization. And I found this quote somewhere to remind ourselves that we're responsible to others, but not always for others. And knowing that balance is, I think, difficult. You know, in Galatians chapter 6, Paul says that we're to bear one another's burdens, togetherness, sharing. And then just a couple of verses later says, everyone needs to bear their own burden, which seems like a contradiction, but to me, that's a good definition of differentiation that Paul is talking about in kind of shorthand there. Another illustration that's helped me in this area is to think of the difference between a raw egg and a super ball. Now, most of you are way too young to even remember what a super ball is, but so when I was growing up, it was a Whammo toy, and it was this hyper bouncy ball that would go twice as high as what you threw it. And often I've used this illustration. If you drop the egg, obviously we know what it's going to do. And then if we drop the ball, the bouncy ball, we know what it's going to do. And the difference has to do with what's at the core. And I think that's really hard when you're in a revitalization ministry, because it's really what's at the core of our being, our soul. Is it soft and gooey? Or is there something solid there and flexible? Do we have internal resiliency? Is there the capacity to bounce back? In 2 Corinthians 4, Paul gives this list, I'm down, but not out. That kind of resiliency within. So there's a solid yet flexible sense of self. A classic definition of differentiation is a self-defined identity with a non-anxious presence. Self-defined identity with a non-anxious presence. I've kind of tweaked that over time for me to say it's a God-defined identity with a less anxious presence. Because I don't know about you, but man, there's been so much anxiety sometimes at night, I've laid awake. And conversations are rehashed and rehearsed, and the emotion tends to eat away, and there's anxiety. But the goal is to be the less anxious person in the room. That's not something we can generate, but something we have to rely on God to enable. So the tension is, I want to be honest and acknowledge my anxiety without allowing it to drive my behavior. And so often that means I'm going to be a thermostat. I'm going to regulate. I'm going to manage my own emotions and take care of my own anxiety first and foremost. And for me, that's meant a calming, developing a calming rhythm or reaction or response, especially if I'm in the midst of a conversation that turns fierce and tough. I'll literally take a deep breath and try to slow everything down. People with anxiety want immediate, quick fixes. They want you to respond on the spare of the moment. And I've learned to say, let me think about that and I'll get back to you. Because 9 times out of 10, if I respond in the moment, it's going to reflect back some negative things. And it also helps the other people know that it's not quite as intense or it's not the priority that they may think it is. And another thing that has been hard for me is to learn how to be more comfortable with discomfort. There's conversations, I've been in board meetings where, wow, the dissonance, the tension, you cut with a knife. And everything inside of me says run. And to learn that I'm going to survive. This is uncomfortable, doesn't feel good, but God is here. He's in control, and I'm going to try to allow him to calm the waters inside of me so that I can be his influence in the midst of troubled waters. And so that I can make decisions based on principle, not expediency. So the tendency is just to capitulate and give in and tell people what they want to hear, make them happy, not to cause more problems. And that's risky business. I read this week this quote that risk is an inconvenient necessity. It's an inconvenient necessity as revitalization pastors. It pushes us out of our comfort zone. Well, that's a lot. This is an area that God has been at work inside of me, realizing that as a revitalization leader, the primary tool is who God is making me as a person. It's not great strategies or ideas or even preaching. It's who I am in Christ in those nitty-gritty conversations and interactions with others. And I'm reminded that we're not alone in this, even though it feels like that at times, that Jesus is our coach. Jesus is our mentor. And I asked you earlier to be thinking about this. How did Jesus respond to anxiety? What sources of anxiety did he confront, both internally and externally? And I want to break out of a monologue and get some interaction just for a couple minutes here. But when you think of Jesus and his ministry, what kinds of things come to mind in terms of the kinds of pressures that he experienced, and how did he respond? What can we learn from him?
Steve, you
Yeah.
have any concluding comments you want to make?
Nope, that's good.
Yeah. Hey, thanks. Wow. Well said. Touched my own heart. I think it's resonates with all of us. We walk in this journey with a lot of anxiety, and very, very helpful. Guys, this has been recorded as well. So Amber, can you clue us into how we can jump back on the recording at some point? How do we get a hold of it?
Yep. The recording will be up on our website. So if you would like to check back, probably in a couple days, we'll get our communications gal will just get the teaching part and not all of your comments on the recording. Get that all figured out, and then it'll go up on our website under church revitalization, so you should be able to find it.
Let me just show this. Leadership Courage by Kirk Kirlin talks about a lot of the stuff that Steve just talked about. I like the way Steve says it a little better than Kirk, I have to be honest. But it's not, this isn't necessarily my top 10 books, but I've just been reading it recently. And he speaks to this very issue of having courage in a time of cowardice in churches to be leaders that make good decisions with a non-anxious presence, because in fact, we do it Jesus' way. So it talks about self-differentiation as well, those kinds of things. So right up the same alley. If you want a copy of that, let me know. All righty. See you next month, same time, same date, and the third Thursday, I guess, of the month. Steve will be facilitating that, Steve Conway, since I will not be able to be here, but you'll be in good hands. So thanks, everybody. Want to respect your time.